Every major American disaster comes with an official story. Some are incomplete, some are suspiciously convenient, and some fall apart the moment you look at the actual paperwork. Here are 31 of them. 1. The Titanic sank because of a freak accident. An unseen iceberg on a dark and tragic night. Pure bad luck. Nature versus man. A heartbreaking story with no villain worth naming. That is the version people are comfortable repeating. Here is the version that actually holds up. The ship received at least 6 separate ice warnings on the day it went down, including a message from the SS Mesaba at 9:40 in the evening that was never delivered to the bridge because the wireless operators were too busy handling passenger telegrams. White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay was aboard and had reportedly encouraged the captain to maintain speed to arrive in New York ahead of schedule, a claim Ismay denied under oath, but that multiple surviving officers alluded to in testimony. The ship was traveling at approximately 22.5 knots, close to its top speed, in a known ice field, at night, with no moonlight, flat calm seas that ironically reduced the visibility of wave action at the base of icebergs, and a lookout team without binoculars, because the binoculars had been locked in a cabinet and the key left behind in Southampton. A nearby ship, the Californian, had stopped for the night because of the same ice conditions. Its radio operator had gone to sleep. Its crew saw rockets fired from the Titanic and interpreted them as company signals. The British and American inquiries both concluded that Captain Smith had acted in accordance with the practice of the time, a finding that effectively shielded the entire industry from accountability and allowed the same reckless speed culture to continue in North Atlantic shipping for years afterward. The ship carried enough lifeboats for roughly half the passengers, and even those were launched partially empty because the crew had not been drilled on proper loading procedures. 705 of the 2,224 people aboard survived. The official verdict was essentially this: everyone was speeding. Nobody had working safety equipment. The road was covered in ice, and the whole thing was more or less standard industry practice. They updated the guidelines afterward. The people who wrote the guidelines were, of course, the same industry that had just demonstrated what the old guidelines produced. 2. The 1871 Great Chicago Fire started when a clumsy cow in a barn kicked over a lantern belonging to an Irish immigrant woman, and that story spread across the country because it was colorful, simple, and landed in a period when Irish Catholic immigrants were an extremely convenient target for public blame. The reporter who wrote it, Michael Ahern of the Chicago Republican, admitted in 1893 that he had fabricated the entire cow detail. His confession received minimal attention, and the myth outlived him by well over a century. The actual cause of the fire has never been officially determined. The city convened an investigation and produced no conclusive finding. Multiple origin theories exist, including a fire accidentally set during a gambling session in the barn, and a more extraordinary theory proposed by researcher Robert Wood suggesting the fire was ignited by debris from a comet, the same object potentially responsible for the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin, which burned simultaneously on the same night and killed approximately 2,500 people, making it by a significant margin the deadliest fire in American history. Peshtigo received almost no national attention because Chicago was more economically and culturally prominent, which tells you something about how disaster coverage has always worked. The fire destroyed roughly 3 1/3 square miles of the city, killed an estimated 300 people, and left approximately 100,000 homeless. Catherine O'Leary, the woman whose barn was the origin point, was subjected to public harassment and condemnation for the rest of her life, rarely left her home, and died in 1895. The Chicago City Council did not officially exonerate her until 1997, 126 years after the fire. The ethnic and religious dimensions of the blame assignment were not accidental. Assigning responsibility to an immigrant woman and her barnyard animal was consistent with the cultural politics of the era. A reporter invented the cow. He later admitted it. The story outlived the admission by over a century, and the woman at the center of it spent her remaining years inside her house because a journalist needed a colorful detail on deadline. Accuracy and a good story have always been in competition, and in 1871, the story won by a considerable margin. 3. The USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898. 266 American sailors died, and within weeks, the American press had decided Spain did it. The public agreed, and the country went to war behind the rallying cry of "Remember the Maine." The problem is that Spain almost certainly did not do it, and a United States Navy reinvestigation conducted in 1976 concluded the explosion was most likely caused by spontaneous combustion in a coal bunker adjacent to the ammunition magazine, a known risk on ships of that design. The original Naval Court of Inquiry reached its external mine conclusion with almost no forensic evidence and under considerable political pressure to produce a finding that justified military action. Newspaper publishers William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were running competing papers through a circulation war at the time and used the explosion as the centerpiece of their rivalry, publishing banner headlines blaming Spain before any investigation had concluded anything. The apocryphal story about Hearst, telling an illustrator he would furnish the war if the illustrator furnished the pictures, has never been definitively confirmed, but it has never been definitively denied either, which is its own kind of summary. Spain had strong strategic incentives not to blow up a United States warship. They were actively trying to avoid war with America, had been making diplomatic concessions, and understood that attacking an American naval vessel would be tactically suicidal. The war that followed the Maine explosion resulted in the United States acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and stabilizing American influence over Cuba, where significant United States business interests, including substantial sugar investments, were directly at stake. The lead investigator on the 1898 inquiry later privately expressed doubt about the mine conclusion. Those doubts were not published. The phrase became a national slogan for a war launched on evidence that modern forensic analysis has essentially dismantled. The official story was written before the investigation started. That is not an inquiry. That is a press release that needed a body count to land properly, and it got one. 4. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 killed 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women, and the owners of the factory were tried for manslaughter. They were acquitted after less than 2 hours of jury deliberation. Then they collected approximately $400 per dead worker in insurance profits above their actual losses and went back to operating factories. The exits were locked, and this was not an oversight. Isaac Harris and Max Blanc had survived a previous fire at the same factory in 1902 and had a documented history of locking stairwell doors during working hours to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing fabric scraps. On March 25, 1911, workers on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors discovered a fire. The 9th floor's stairwell door on the Green Street side was locked. The Washington Place exit was also locked. Witnesses testified that the door required a key that only supervisors carried. 146 of the approximately 500 workers in the building died, many by jumping from the 9th floor windows to avoid burning. The fire department's ladders reached the 6th floor. The safety nets used to catch jumpers broke under the weight. The defense attorney successfully argued that the owners did not know the door was locked at the specific moment of the fire, a standard of knowledge so narrow it was essentially impossible to meet, and the jury accepted it. Following the acquittal, civil lawsuits were settled at $75 per deceased victim. Harris and Blanc were caught violating labor laws again in 1913, locking factory doors during working hours, and were fined $20. The fire directly catalyzed the labor movement and produced 36 new workplace safety laws in New York, many drafted by Francis Perkins, who witnessed the fire and later became the architect of several foundational worker protections under Franklin Roosevelt. They locked the doors, collected the insurance, paid the fine, and kept locking doors. The workers got a labor movement. The owners got a $20 citation. Only one of those outcomes had any real teeth, and it took decades to grow them. 5. The Radium Girls were poisoned by their employer before anyone understood the dangers of radiation, which is the version of this story that lets everyone off the hook. Here is the version that does not. The United States Radium Corporation hired young women in the 1910s and 1920s to paint watch dials with radium-based luminescent paint and taught them to point their brushes with their lips to achieve fine detail work, a technique called lip pointing. Company officials and scientists working with radium at the same facilities wore lead aprons and used tongs to handle the material. The workers were told the paint was harmless. By 1924, the company physician examining sick workers was not a licensed physician in New Jersey at the time of the examinations. A second doctor was paid by the company and supported a syphilis diagnosis for multiple workers, a diagnosis designed to stigmatize the women and eliminate their legal standing. Industrial toxicologist Alice Hamilton had been warning about the dangers of radium ingestion since the early 1920s. Her warnings were dismissed. Internal company documents later revealed that management had access to medical research confirming radium's toxicity long before the workers began dying. Workers' bones were becoming radioactive. Their jaws deteriorated. Their spines collapsed. At least 50 confirmed deaths are attributed to radium poisoning among the dial painters, and researchers believe the actual number is significantly higher. 5 women filed suit against the company in 1927. The company delayed the case for years, hoping the plaintiffs would die before trial. Several were already bedridden when they reached a settlement in 1928. Their case established the legal precedent that employers could be held liable for occupational diseases and was foundational in developing United States occupational health and safety law. The standards developed from their case were later used in the Manhattan Project to set permissible radiation exposure limits. The company's scientists wore protective equipment while telling the workers the paint was essentially harmless. One group understood radiation. The other group was dying of it. The distinction between those two groups was not an accident of knowledge. It was a deliberate arrangement. 6. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s was a natural catastrophe, a drought that descended on the Great Plains, a force of nature that farmers could not have foreseen or prevented. The drought was real. The catastrophe was manufactured. The southern Great Plains were originally covered in deep-rooted native grasses, blue grama and buffalo grass among them, that had evolved over thousands of years specifically to hold soil in place during drought cycles. Their root systems extended several feet deep. They had survived similar dry periods for centuries without producing an ecological collapse. Between 1900 and 1930, the federal government actively incentivized settlers to plow the plains through the Homestead Act and subsequent programs, and advertising campaigns from railroads and land speculators promoted a completely fabricated theory called rain follows the plow, which claimed that farming itself caused rainfall. The mechanized plow allowed farmers to break up vastly more land faster than any previous technology. Between 1925 and 1930, millions of additional acres of native grassland were converted to cropland across Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico. When the multi-year drought hit, there was nothing holding the topsoil in place. Wind picked it up and carried it across the continent. Dust clouds reached Washington and ships at sea hundreds of miles off the Atlantic coast. The April 14th, 1935. Black Sunday storm generated a dust wall estimated at 200 miles wide and 8,000 feet high. Visibility dropped to zero. Livestock were found suffocated in fields. Hugh Hammond Bennett, a soil scientist who had been warning the government about topsoil erosion since the 1920s, was testifying before Congress on the day Black Sunday's dust cloud reached Washington. He reportedly pointed to the darkened sky outside the window and said, "This, gentlemen, is what I have been talking about." Congress passed the Soil Conservation Act shortly afterward. The federal policies that created the conditions for the Dust Bowl were replicated in subsequent decades. The 1970s agricultural boom applied several of the same practices to the same region and contributed to a second dust crisis. The government told farmers to plow the prairie, guaranteed it would rain, and called it a natural disaster when it did not. The sky was not the problem. The policy was. 7. The Texas City explosion of April 19th, 47, is described as a catastrophic accident. Ammonium nitrate fertilizer on a docked ship caught fire and exploded, and nobody could have known the danger in time to stop it. The fire on the SS Grand Camp had been visible and reported for over an hour before the detonation. Texas City firefighters were on scene at the dock. Hundreds of dock workers, city employees, and curious spectators had gathered to watch the smoke, standing at the waterfront completely unaware that ammonium nitrate is a high explosive that becomes increasingly unstable as it heats. The ship's captain had ordered the hold sealed and steam smothered rather than flooded with water, a decision likely made to protect the cargo from water damage. Steam smothering is now understood to have accelerated the fire rather than suppressed it in this context because the hold's temperature continued building. At 9:12 in the morning, the Grand Camp detonated. The explosion was felt in Houston, 40 miles away. The blast wave knocked people down across the city. It generated a 15-foot wave in the harbor. 2 small planes flying overhead were destroyed. The explosion registered on seismographs as far away as Denver. 2 hours later, a second ship, the SS High Flyer, also loaded with ammonium nitrate, exploded in the same harbor after being set on fire by debris from the first explosion. The final death toll was approximately 581 confirmed dead, with estimates ranging higher due to incomplete records of dock workers. Nearly all of Texas City's fire department was killed in the initial blast. They had been fighting the ship fire from the dock. It remains the deadliest industrial accident in United States history. The disaster led to significant changes in the regulation and labeling of ammonium nitrate. In April 2013, the West Fertilizer Company in West Texas experienced a near-identical explosion that killed 15 people and injured 160. Regulatory enforcement on ammonium nitrate storage had remained inconsistent for nearly 80 years between those two events. They spent an hour watching a smoking bomb while debating water damage to the cargo. Then they filed it as an accident. An accident is when nobody sees it coming. This one had an audience and a clock. 8. Love Canal was a chemical contamination tragedy that was discovered in the late 1970s, and once it was discovered, the government acted, families were relocated, and the system eventually worked. The Hooker Chemical Company deposited approximately 21,000 tons of chemical waste, including dioxins, benzene, chloroform, and over 200 other compounds, into an abandoned canal in Niagara Falls, New York, between 1942 and 1953. In 1953, Hooker sold the site to the Niagara Falls School Board for $1, with a deed that explicitly warned of the buried chemicals and disclaimed liability. The school board built a public elementary school on top of the site. The surrounding neighborhood was developed with homes built directly over and adjacent to the buried waste. By the mid-1970s, residents were reporting unusually high rates of miscarriage, birth defects, and cancers. Children playing in their own backyards were coming into contact with a black, oily residue pushing up through the soil. A local reporter began documenting the patterns. Lois Gibbs, a homemaker with no scientific background whose son's school was built on the dump site, began canvassing her neighborhood and compiling health records in 1978. Her data showed clusters of illness that followed the contours of the buried canal almost exactly. New York State's health commissioner declared a public health emergency in August 1978 and recommended that pregnant women and children under 2 evacuate, which implicitly acknowledged the danger but left most residents in place. President Carter declared Love Canal a federal emergency that year, the first time a federal emergency had been declared for anything other than a natural disaster. Approximately 800 families were eventually relocated. Hooker Chemical's parent company, Occidental Petroleum, ultimately settled lawsuits for over $227 million. Love Canal became the primary catalyst for the passage of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act in 1980, commonly known as Superfund, which created the legal framework for cleaning up toxic waste sites nationally. They put a school on top of 21,000 tons of chemical waste, sold the land for $1, and included a note about liability. The note was written for the lawyers. Nobody thought to put a note in the children's lunchboxes. 9. The Ford Pinto's fuel tank defect was a manufacturing oversight that led to tragic fires, and when Ford discovered the problem, they moved to address it. Ford engineers identified the rear fuel tank defect before the car went into production. An internal cost-benefit analysis concluded that paying wrongful death settlements would be less expensive than redesigning the fuel system, and the company chose the settlements. The Pinto was designed and rushed to market in the late 1960s under pressure from Ford's president at the time, with a production timeline that compressed the usual development process. The car was to weigh under 2,000 pounds and cost under $2,000. Crash testing during development revealed that the fuel tank's positioning, directly behind the rear axle with insufficient crush space between the tank and the rear bumper, caused the tank to rupture and catch fire in rear-end collisions above approximately 25 miles per hour. The fuel filler neck was also prone to separation in crashes, creating a secondary ignition risk. Ford engineers identified at least 3 inexpensive modifications that could reduce the fire risk, including a rubber bladder lining and a repositioned tank, and estimated these modifications at between $6 and $11 per vehicle. The internal document that became known as the Pinto Memo calculated that the total cost of implementing a fix across all affected vehicles would be approximately $137 million. It then calculated the estimated payout for all projected deaths and injuries from the fire defect at approximately $49.5 million, using a federal value of human life figure of $200,000 per death and $67,000 per injury. The document concluded that the fix was not cost-effective. Ford lobbied against federal fuel system safety standards throughout the early 1970s, using arguments based on their own cost-benefit calculations to delay implementation. A 1977 investigation brought the memo to public attention. Subsequent lawsuits produced a jury award of $125 million in punitive damages, later reduced on appeal. Ford was indicted on criminal reckless homicide charges in Indiana in 1978, a landmark first for a corporation, though it was ultimately acquitted. The federal recall was ordered in 1978. The modification cost approximately $11 per vehicle, exactly what the engineers had originally estimated. They did the math, determined that dead customers were cheaper than safer cars, and filed the memo. The arithmetic was correct. The decision was not. 10. The Exxon Valdez ran aground on Bligh Reef in Prince William Sound, Alaska, in March '89, spilling approximately 11 million gallons of crude oil, and the company responded immediately with every available resource. Exxon had submitted an oil spill contingency plan to the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation that promised a specific rapid response. Containment boom deployed within 5 hours. Skimmers operational within 12 hours. When the spill occurred, the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, the consortium responsible for the first response, could not come close to meeting those timelines. The Alyeska response barge, which was supposed to be fully equipped and on standby for exactly this type of emergency, was out of service for repairs at the time of the grounding. Equipment including boom and skimmers had to be located, assembled, and transported, consuming critical hours. The first 12 to 24 hours after a major oil spill represent the optimal window for mechanical containment. Weather conditions were relatively calm immediately after the grounding. By the time meaningful response equipment arrived, winds had accelerated to 70 miles per hour, breaking up any boom deployment and spreading the oil across Prince William Sound. Approximately 1,300 miles of Alaskan coastline were ultimately contaminated. An estimated 250,000 seabirds, 2,800 sea otters, 300 harbor seals, 250 bald eagles, and billions of salmon and herring eggs were killed. The herring population in Prince William Sound has never recovered. Exxon spent approximately $2.1 billion on cleanup, with limited effectiveness on deeply embedded oil in rocky shorelines. Studies later showed that much of the high-pressure hot water cleaning used during the response killed more intertidal organisms than the oil itself had. The Oil Pollution Act of 1990 subsequently required double-hull tanker construction for vessels operating in United States waters, a safety standard that had been discussed and resisted by the industry for years before the spill. The Exxon Valdez was refloated, repaired, barred from Alaskan waters, and eventually sold. It continued sailing under different names until 2012. Exxon filed a rapid response plan with the government, stored the equipment in a warehouse, and held press conferences about environmental responsibility. The barge designated to handle exactly this scenario was in the shop. The oil was not waiting for it. 11. The Bhopal gas disaster of December 1984 killed thousands of people in India. It was caused by a local plant failure, and Union Carbide, the American parent company, did what it could from a distance, constrained by geography and legal jurisdiction. Union Carbide's United States headquarters controlled the safety protocols governing that plant. An internal safety audit conducted in 1982, 2 years before the disaster, identified more than 60 safety hazards at the Bhopal facility, 30 of which were classified as major. The audit recommended immediate corrective action. The corrective action was not taken. On the night of December 2nd into 3rd, approximately 40 tons of methyl isocyanate gas leaked from the plant and spread across densely populated neighborhoods. Multiple safety systems were non-functional at the time of the release. The refrigeration unit designed to keep the methyl isocyanate cool had been shut off to save money. The flare tower designed to burn off escaping gas was under maintenance. The scrubber designed to neutralize escaping gas with caustic soda was also offline. The immediate death toll was estimated by the Indian government at approximately 3,800 people. Independent researchers and medical organizations estimate the total death toll, including long-term health consequences, at between 15,000 and 20,000 people. Warren Anderson, Union Carbide's chief executive, flew to India after the disaster, was arrested by Indian authorities on charges including culpable homicide, was released on bail, returned to the United States, and subsequently refused to return for trial. He was declared a fugitive from Indian justice in 1992. The United States State Department did not extradite him. He lived in retirement until his death in 2014. Union Carbide settled a civil case with the Indian government in 1989 for $470 million. The per-victim compensation ultimately distributed averaged approximately $550 per person for injuries including permanent blindness, respiratory disease, and neurological damage. Dow Chemical acquired Union Carbide in 2001 and has consistently refused to accept liability or fund additional cleanup of the plant site, which continues to contaminate local groundwater. The safety audit said, "Fix it." The company said it was not worth the expense. The chief executive left the country. The courts helped with the travel arrangements. The plant site is still there. The groundwater is still contaminated. 12. Asbestos was used for decades because science had not yet caught up with the dangers. And once researchers documented the risks in the 1970s and 80s, regulations followed. The link between asbestos and fatal lung disease was documented in scientific literature as early as the 1930s. Industry groups funded studies specifically designed to manufacture doubt about findings they did not want published. Workers continued dying while the paperwork debated the question. A landmark study published in Britain in 1930 documented widespread pulmonary fibrosis, a condition called asbestosis, among asbestos factory workers with significant exposure. United States researchers, including Dr. Leroy Gardner, were conducting similar studies in the early 1930s, with results funded in part by the Johns Manville Corporation, the largest asbestos manufacturer in the country. Johns Manville suppressed the research findings. Internal corporate documents obtained decades later in litigation showed that company officials were aware of the fatal lung disease connection and made deliberate decisions not to inform workers or modify working conditions. Metropolitan Life Insurance Company conducted its own asbestos worker health studies in the 1930s and shared findings with manufacturers, including data showing elevated mortality among exposed workers, without making those findings public or notifying the workers. The Saranac Laboratory Studies, funded in part by the asbestos industry throughout the 1930s and 1940s, produced data documenting serious disease, but were not published in full. Industry representatives had contractual approval over what could be released from the research they had paid for. Mesothelioma, a cancer of the lung lining caused almost exclusively by asbestos exposure, has a latency period of 20 to 50 years following exposure. This long delay between exposure and disease made it straightforward for industry to argue scientific uncertainty and delay regulation, even as former workers began dying in large numbers. It is estimated that asbestos-related diseases will kill approximately 40,000 Americans annually through the middle of the 21st century, the majority from exposures that occurred decades ago. The United States still has not issued a comprehensive ban on all asbestos use. They funded the research, read the results, filed the results in a drawer, and kept mining. When the workers started dying 40 years later, the industry called it science catching up. The science had already caught up. It was the regulation that was filed away. 13. The FDA's regulatory system protected Americans from thalidomide, the drug that caused devastating birth defects across Europe and Canada in the late 1950s and early 60s. The system worked. The protection was the decision of one person, Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey, a pharmacologist who had recently joined the FDA, and she spent 14 months being pressured, threatened, and lobbied aggressively by the drug company, while her supervisors received complaints about her. The William S. Merrill Company applied to the FDA in September 1960 for approval to market thalidomide in the United States under the name Kevidon. Thalidomide had been developed by a German pharmaceutical company and marketed across Europe and Canada, starting in 1957 as a sedative and treatment for morning sickness, promoted as completely safe even in overdose. It was responsible for an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 birth defects globally, primarily a condition in which limbs are severely shortened or absent, and thousands of infant deaths. Kelsey found the application's supporting safety data inadequate, particularly regarding the drug's effects on fetal development and its neurological side effects in adults. She repeatedly rejected the application and requested additional data. The Merrill Company responded by going over her head to her supervisors, visiting the FDA repeatedly to pressure approval, and writing letters characterizing Kelsey as uncooperative and not acting in good faith. The pressure campaign lasted 14 months. Kelsey continued to refuse approval. In November 1961, German researchers publicly confirmed the thalidomide birth defect connection. The drug was withdrawn from European markets, and the Merrill application was withdrawn. Approximately 20,000 Americans had received thalidomide as part of a physician sample distribution program that operated while the approval was pending, before approval was ever granted. Approximately 17 documented American thalidomide-affected babies were born. In 1962, President Kennedy awarded Kelsey the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service. The episode directly catalyzed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962, which for the first time required pharmaceutical companies to prove efficacy, not just safety, before approval. One person stood between Americans and a generation of preventable birth defects. The drug company's response was to file complaints with her management. The system that protected the public was not a system. It was a single pharmacologist who did not like their paperwork. 14. The 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in 1979 was serious, but contained. Radiation releases were small and controlled according to official reports. There were no deaths. The evacuation was precautionary, and the system performed adequately. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's own internal communications, released years later, showed that officials were aware of considerably greater uncertainty about the radiation release than their public statements reflected, and that messaging decisions were being made with the explicit goal of preventing public panic, a goal that influenced the content of what was communicated to residents. On March 28, 1979, a combination of equipment failure, design flaws, and operator error caused a partial meltdown of the reactor core at 3 Mile Island Unit 2 near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The reactor core was approximately 50% damaged. Pennsylvania's governor recommended evacuation for pregnant women and preschool-age children within 5 miles of the plant, an advisory that acknowledged elevated risk for the most vulnerable populations while leaving most residents in place. Epidemiologist Dr. Stephen Wing of the University of North Carolina conducted a reanalysis in the 1990s of the original Columbia University Health Study, the primary study cited to show no health effects, and found methodological problems that had suppressed evidence of elevated cancer rates downwind of the plant. A study published in Environmental Health Perspectives in 2008 found elevated rates of lung cancer and leukemia in populations near the plant following the accident. The exact quantity of radiation released remains disputed between official NRC figures and estimates by independent researchers who have argued the official figures significantly undercount the release. The accident released radioactive gases into the atmosphere. A class action lawsuit involving approximately 2,000 plaintiffs claiming health effects was ultimately dismissed. The accident effectively ended new nuclear power plant construction in the United States for decades. No new nuclear plant was ordered and completed in the country between 1977 and 2023. The official communication strategy was to prevent panic, which is a reasonable institutional goal until you examine what it actually required. Crafting public statements that reflected confidence the officials did not privately hold. Preventing panic and telling the truth are not always the same sentence, and in the spring of 1979, they were not. 15. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster on January 28, 1986, was caused by an O-ring failure in unusually cold temperatures, a technical malfunction that was not fully understood before launch. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, explicitly warned NASA officials the night before the launch that the cold temperatures made the O-rings unsafe. They recommended postponing. Management overruled them. On the evening of January 27th, engineers conducted a teleconference with NASA managers and presented data showing that the O-ring seals that joined sections of the solid rocket booster had never been tested at temperatures below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The forecasted launch temperature for January 28th was 29 degrees. Thiokol engineer Roger Boisjoli had written an internal memo in July 1985 warning that the O-ring erosion problem could result in a catastrophic failure and recommending grounding the shuttle fleet until the issue was resolved. The memo was classified and not shared with NASA decision-makers. During the teleconference, Thiokol engineers recommended against launching. NASA's Lawrence Malloy pushed back, asking, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch next April?" Multiple engineers later described this as pressure to reverse the recommendation. NASA Vice President Gerald Mason told Thiokol Vice President Robert Lund to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat before the final vote. Thiokol management overruled their own engineers and approved the launch. 4 Thiokol engineers later testified that they were opposed to the launch decision. Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch, killing all 7 crew members. The Rogers Commission found that NASA's organizational culture, including schedule pressure and a normalization of known technical risk, was a primary cause alongside the specific physical failure. Richard Feynman, the physicist who served on the Rogers Commission, conducted his own independent investigation and concluded that NASA management's decision-making bore no resemblance to scientific risk assessment, and that the organization had convinced itself that known risks were acceptable through a process of bureaucratic drift. He dropped an O-ring in a glass of ice water at a press conference to demonstrate the failure mechanism. It was the clearest communication in the entire program. The engineers said, "Do not launch." Management said launch. The rocket agreed with the engineers. 16. The Columbia disaster in February 2003 was caused by foam debris striking the heat shield on launch, an unpredictable event NASA responded to with the information it had available. Engineers raised concerns about the foam strike during the mission. They were denied access to Department of Defense satellite imagery that could have assessed the damage. The decision not to investigate further was made under the assumption that nothing could be done in orbit anyway, an assumption that the Columbia Accident Investigation Board later found to be factually incorrect. On January 16, 2003, Columbia launched on mission STS-107. Approximately 81 seconds after launch, a piece of foam insulation broke off from the external tank's bipod ramp and struck the leading edge of Columbia's left wing at a relative velocity of approximately 530 miles per hour. NASA's debris assessment team analyzed the strike and concluded the damage was potentially serious. Engineers submitted 3 formal requests to the Department of Defense for satellite or ground-based imaging of the wing to assess actual damage, imaging that was technically feasible and available. NASA senior managers, including Mission Management Team Chair Linda Ham, determined that even if the wing was seriously damaged, nothing could be done to fix it in orbit, and that raising the issue would only increase crew anxiety. The imaging requests were canceled or not escalated. The investigation board found that had the damage been identified early in the mission, a rescue using Shuttle Atlantis, then in advanced launch preparation, was technically feasible within the 16-day mission window. On February 1, 2003, Columbia re-entered Earth's atmosphere. Hot gas penetrated the damaged leading edge and destroyed the wing. The shuttle broke apart over Texas and Louisiana, killing all 7 crew members. The investigation board's report quoted a NASA manager's email from during the mission, stating that without imaging data, there was no issue. The board characterized this as a textbook example of the organizational dysfunction they had identified, which was the same organizational dysfunction that had produced Challenger 17 years earlier. 17 astronauts, 2 shuttle programs, 1 management culture that had been formally identified as the problem after the first disaster and remained in place for the second. 17. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 overwhelmed New Orleans' levee system with unprecedented floodwaters, a natural disaster that exceeded what the infrastructure was designed to handle. The levees did not fail because the storm was too powerful for them. In the majority of critical breaches, they collapsed structurally at water levels below their own design specifications. The Army Corps of Engineers' own post-event forensic analysis, released in 2006, concluded that the hurricane protection system in New Orleans and southeast Louisiana was a system in name only, and that design and construction flaws were the primary cause of the catastrophic flooding, not the storm's intensity. A separate independent investigation by the American Society of Civil Engineers concluded that the levee failures were the largest civil engineering failure in United States history, attributing them to inadequate design, inadequate quality control during construction, and inadequate maintenance. The failures were caused primarily by eye-wall structures built on inadequate soil foundations that collapsed when water reached certain levels, not by water overtopping the structures. FEMA had published a detailed planning exercise in 2004 called Hurricane Pam that predicted near exactly the flooding, casualties, and infrastructure failure that Katrina produced 1 year later. The recommendations from that exercise had not been implemented. The Army Corps had received studies and warnings about the inadequacy of the New Orleans levee system dating back decades. A 2001 FEMA report listed a major New Orleans hurricane as one of the 3 most likely catastrophic disasters facing the United States. Approximately 1,833 people were killed by the storm and subsequent flooding, the distribution of which neighborhoods flooded and which did not track closely with the legacy of racially discriminatory infrastructure investment decisions. The Army Corps accepted legal responsibility for the levee failures in 2008, acknowledging that its engineering errors were a direct cause of the flooding. They built a flood protection system, received formal documentation that it had fundamental design flaws, filed the findings, and left the system in place. The storm did not defeat the engineering. The engineering was already losing before the storm made landfall. 18. The opioid epidemic grew from legitimate pain management medicine that turned out to be more addictive than anyone initially understood. A medical and scientific failure where Purdue Pharma made miscalculations without fully grasping the consequences. Purdue Pharma knew OxyContin was being abused within years of its launch. Internal documents showed executives were aware of diversion and addiction patterns. They used that awareness to develop strategic responses that protected market share rather than to issue warnings. Purdue launched OxyContin in 1996 with the central marketing claim that its extended-release formulation made it significantly less prone to abuse than other opioids, a claim the FDA allowed Purdue to include in the original drug labeling. This claim became the cornerstone of Purdue's sales strategy targeting primary care physicians. By 1999 and 2000, Purdue's own sales representatives were filing reports noting that OxyContin was being crushed and snorted or injected for immediate effect, completely defeating the extended release mechanism that was supposed to reduce abuse potential. Internal documents revealed in litigation showed that executives received these reports. Purdue's response was not to issue safety warnings or reformulate the drug, but to develop messaging for its sales force about how to respond to physician concerns about addiction. Messaging designed to minimize the concern rather than address it. A 2007 federal guilty plea by a Purdue subsidiary acknowledged that the company had misbranded OxyContin by claiming it was less addictive than competing opioids, and Purdue agreed to pay $634 million in fines. 3 top executives pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges. Internal Sackler family communications, revealed in bankruptcy proceedings, showed family members directing strategies to manage public perception of the addiction crisis rather than reduce prescriptions. Between 1999 and 2021, approximately 500,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. Purdue Pharma agreed to a bankruptcy settlement in 2021 that created a fund of approximately $4.5 billion for abatement programs, a settlement many victim advocates characterized as inadequate. 500,000 people did not die of a medical misunderstanding. They died of a marketing campaign that kept running after the company knew what it was doing. 19. The Flint water crisis was a tragic infrastructure failure, where Michigan officials made a cost-saving decision with unforeseen consequences. And when the contamination became apparent, the government moved to protect residents. The dangers of the water source switch were predictable, and, in some respects, predicted. State officials received reports of contaminated water and an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease and suppressed them. An EPA scientist was directed to stay quiet. Residents were told the water was safe when officials possessed evidence to the contrary. In April 2014, the state-appointed emergency manager overseeing Flint, Michigan, switched the city's water source from Detroit's treated Lake Huron water to the Flint River as a cost-saving measure estimated to save approximately $5 million over 2 years. The critical failure was the decision not to add corrosion control chemicals to the Flint River water, a violation of federal lead and copper rule requirements. Without corrosion control, the highly corrosive water stripped lead from aging lead service lines and plumbing throughout the city's distribution system. By the summer and fall of 2014, residents were reporting discolored, foul-smelling water. General Motors stopped using Flint River water at its engine plant in October 2014 because it was corroding engine parts. A Virginia Tech research team found lead levels in some residential water samples exceeding 1,000 parts per billion. The EPA's threshold for hazardous waste classification is 5,000 parts per billion. The safe level for children is 0. An EPA scientist named Miguel del Toral wrote an internal memo in June 2015 identifying the lead crisis. His supervisor instructed him to treat it as a draft and not to share it publicly. The Michigan Department of Environmental Conservation publicly dismissed his concerns. Dr. Mona Hanna Atisha, a Flint pediatrician, published blood lead level data in September 2015, showing that blood lead levels in Flint children had doubled since the water switch. State officials publicly disputed her findings and attempted to undermine her credibility before being forced to acknowledge the data. The water switch was reversed in October 2015. Full pipe replacement was not completed until years later. They switched the water to save $5 million, spent years telling people the poisoned water was acceptable, and relied on a pediatrician and a Virginia Tech research team to force a public acknowledgement of conditions the state's own scientist had already documented. 20. The Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill in April 2010 was caused by a catastrophic and unpredictable equipment failure deep underwater, a tragic accident in an inherently dangerous industry. Multiple warning signs of a developing blowout were visible on the rig's instruments in the hours before the explosion. Those signs were misinterpreted during a critical decision-making sequence. Key safety tests had been conducted improperly. The blowout did not arrive without warning. On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig, operating in the Gulf of Mexico, approximately 40 miles off the Louisiana coast, experienced an uncontrolled release of oil and gas that triggered explosions and fire, killing 11 crew members. The rig sank 2 days later, leaving the Macondo well gushing approximately 4.9 million barrels of oil into the Gulf over the following 87 days. In the hours before the explosion, the drilling crew conducted a negative pressure test to verify the well was sealed. The test produced anomalous results indicating the well was not sealed. Pressure readings that should have been at 0 were elevated. The crew debated the readings and ultimately accepted an interpretation that the anomaly was caused by something called a bladder effect, a phenomenon that most drilling engineers later testified they had never heard of, and that is not recognized in standard industry practice. Presidential Commission and congressional investigations found this misinterpretation was the single most consequential error. Had the anomalous readings been correctly identified, drilling personnel had the time and ability to take corrective action. Earlier in the day, BP had made the decision to remove heavy drilling mud from the riser pipe over the objections of the rig operator and the cementing contractor, reducing one of the 3 barriers preventing hydrocarbon flow. Halliburton had conducted internal laboratory tests showing that the cement mixture specified for the Macondo job was unstable, and these results were not shared with BP before the cement was used. The blowout preventer, the last resort safety device, designed to cut the drill pipe and seal the well in an emergency, failed to function properly during the blowout due to a damaged component, and post-incident investigation found the device had known maintenance issues. Every instrument on the rig was communicating that the well was not sealed. The team decided the instruments were confused. The well was not confused. 21. The Camp Lejeune water contamination was discovered through environmental monitoring, and the Marine Corps acted appropriately once it was identified. Internal documents show the Marine Corps was warned about contamination in the early 1980s and continued to operate contaminated wells for years before closing them. Families were not formally notified for decades. Camp Lejeune, a Marine Corps base in North Carolina, had drinking water contaminated with volatile organic compounds, primarily trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, benzene, and vinyl chloride, from at least the 1950s through 1985. The primary contamination sources were an on-base dry cleaning facility, industrial solvent use, and off-base dry cleaning operations that leached into groundwater. Internal Marine Corps and Navy documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and litigation revealed that base officials received water testing results indicating contamination in 1980 and 1981, but did not close the contaminated water treatment plants, Tarawa Terrace and Hadnot Point, until 1985. Contaminated water was served to base housing residents, including infants fed formula mixed with tap water throughout this period. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry has documented that an estimated 750,000 to 1 million people were exposed to contaminated water at Camp Lejeune between 1953 and 1987. Studies of former residents and their families have found elevated rates of multiple cancers, including bladder cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and leukemia, as well as elevated rates of Parkinson's disease and specific birth defects. Children of mothers who were pregnant while living on base have shown elevated rates of childhood cancers. The Marine Corps did not formally notify affected families until the late 1990s, and the notification process was criticized as incomplete. Veterans who filed disability claims with the VA citing Camp Lejeune-related illnesses faced decades of denials. The Camp Lejeune Justice Act was signed into law in August 2022, enabling affected veterans and family members to file federal tort claims for the first time. During preceding decades of litigation, the government's primary legal defense was a state statute of repose, effectively using a time limitation to bar claims for contamination the government had concealed. The base knew the water was contaminated. The base kept serving it. The legal strategy that followed was essentially, you waited too long to find out what we were not telling you. 22. The Cuyahoga River catching fire in 1969 was the environmental wake-up call that shocked the nation and launched the modern environmental movement. America looked up and finally saw what industrial pollution had done. The river had caught fire at least 13 times before 1969, including a 1952 fire that caused over $1 million in damage and drew national attention. The 1969 fire was a relatively small event. What changed was not the fire, but the political context surrounding it. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, caught fire multiple times between 1868 and 1969, fueled by industrial waste, oil slicks, and chemical dumping from steel mills, chemical plants, and other industries lining its banks. The fires were not rare surprises. They were recurring industrial events that local residents and industry treated as a cost of operating. The 1952 fire caused approximately $1.3 million in damage, equivalent to over $14 million today, destroyed a boat, burned for several days, and received national news coverage. It was far more destructive than the 1969 fire. The 1969 fire lasted approximately 20 to 25 minutes and caused an estimated $50,000 in damage to a railroad bridge. No photographs of the actual 1969 fire are known to exist. The iconic images frequently published alongside stories about it are photographs from the 1952 fire. The 1969 fire did not receive immediate national attention. It was initially covered as a local news story. Time magazine published a piece on the fire in August '69, months after the event, and it was this coverage that catalyzed the national conversation. The fire's elevation into cultural significance was largely a function of timing. Environmental issues were gaining momentum in 1969. The Santa Barbara oil spill had occurred in January, creating nationwide attention to water pollution, and the National Environmental Policy Act was already being debated in Congress. The Cuyahoga Fire became a usable symbol for an already building movement. The story of 1969 as the singular awakening erases the 101-year documented history of river combustion and the generations of Cleveland residents who had complained about industrial water pollution to no effect. The river had been burning for a century. The country finally looked up in 1969 and asked why. The answer was the same as it had been in 1868. 23. The 1878 yellow fever epidemic that devastated Memphis, Tennessee, was one of the worst public health disasters in American history. And while it receives far less historical attention than disasters of comparable scale, what makes it particularly worth examining is how the city's leadership responded to early warnings and who paid the price for the decisions that followed. Memphis received advance notice that yellow fever was moving north along the Mississippi River from New Orleans in the summer of 1878. The city's Board of Health was warned and chose not to impose a quarantine that would have disrupted river commerce. The steamboat trade was economically central to Memphis, and the business community resisted interruption. By August, the epidemic had reached the city. Within weeks, it was killing hundreds of people per day. Memphis lost approximately 5,000 of its approximately 19,000 residents to the disease during the 1878 outbreak, a mortality rate that places it among the most lethal urban epidemics in United States history. An additional estimated 7,500 people died in the surrounding region. Approximately 25,000 people fled the city during the epidemic, which reduced the concentrated transmission, but also spread the disease outward along the roads and railways connecting Memphis to other communities. The epidemic effectively collapsed the city financially. Memphis was the only major American city to ever surrender its municipal charter, which it did in 1879, following the epidemic's destruction of its tax base and its population. The city operated under state authority for over a decade before reincorporating. Yellow fever is transmitted by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, a fact that was not established scientifically until the early 1900s, meaning that the specific mechanism was unknown in 1878. However, the pattern of the disease moving along river trade routes was documented and recognizable, and the decision to prioritize commerce over quarantine was made with awareness of that pattern. The business community knew an epidemic was approaching, weighed it against the cost of halting river commerce, and chose commerce. The city surrendered its charter the following year. The steamboat trade was not available to file the paperwork. 24. The 1918 influenza pandemic was called the Spanish flu because Spain was where it originated. Spain told the truth. Every other major combatant nation was too occupied with managing wartime morale to report honestly on a pandemic that was killing their soldiers in numbers that rivaled the war itself. The earliest well-documented cases of the 1918 influenza appeared in the spring of 1918 at Camp Funston in Kansas, among United States military personnel. The virus spread to Europe via the mass movement of troops across the Atlantic. Spain, which was not a combatant in World War I and therefore had no wartime press censorship, reported openly on the outbreak, including its impact on King Alfonso XIII. Other nations whose presses were operating under wartime censorship regulations designed to suppress information damaging to military morale did not report the pandemic openly. This created the mistaken impression internationally that Spain was uniquely or disproportionately affected. The Committee on Public Information, the United States government's wartime propaganda agency, and the War Department suppressed reporting on the pandemic's impact on military personnel and civilian health. Newspapers that published stories about the severity of the outbreak risked prosecution under the Espionage Act of 1917. Philadelphia held a Liberty Loan Parade on September 28, 1918, despite being in the grip of a severe flu outbreak and despite warnings from public health officials. Within days of the parade, the city's death rate reached approximately 759 per day at its peak. St. Louis canceled its equivalent event and implemented social distancing measures. Its death rate was approximately 1/8 of Philadelphia's per capita, one of the most dramatic real-world demonstrations of public health intervention effectiveness in United States history. The pandemic infected an estimated 500 million people and killed between 50 and 100 million worldwide. Approximately 675,000 Americans died. The wartime censorship prevented the coordinated public health response that the evidence, had it been published, would have demanded. They called it the Spanish flu because Spain told the truth. Everyone else was managing the narrative. The disease could not be censored. The reporting about it could and was. 25, after the Radium Girls scandal exposed the dangers of occupational radium exposure in New Jersey, the industry reformed its practices, and the legal cases produced meaningful protections for workers going forward. The Radium Dial Company relocated to Ottawa, Illinois, continued the same practices under a new corporate name, and the community surrounding the new facility suffered contamination that persisted for nearly 8 decades. The Radium Dial Company established operations in Ottawa in 1922. A second operation, Luminous Processes, founded by former Radium Dial principals, operated nearby. Ottawa dial painters performed the same lip-pointing technique as the New Jersey workers and were told by management that radium was harmless, despite the fact that the New Jersey cases had already been publicly documented and legally adjudicated before the Ottawa facility was fully operational. When workers began showing signs of radium poisoning in the 1930s, the company again denied the connection and suppressed medical evidence. Catherine Wolfe Donahue became the lead plaintiff in an Ottawa worker case filed in 1937. By the time of her hearing before the Illinois Industrial Commission, she was so ill from radium poisoning that she testified from a stretcher. The commission initially ruled against the workers. The ruling was eventually reversed, and Donahue received a settlement, but she died within months. Radium contamination from the Ottawa factory was so extensive that it spread throughout the surrounding community. Factory waste had been given away to community members for use as fill dirt, provided to children as luminous paint to take home, and incorporated into local construction. Multiple residential properties, businesses, and public spaces were found to contain dangerous levels of radium contamination. The Environmental Protection Agency designated Ottawa's radium contamination sites as Superfund locations beginning in the 1980s. Remediation efforts, including removal of contaminated soil from residential properties, a former school site, and a local park, continued for decades. Final cleanup was not completed until the early 2000s, nearly 80 years after the factory opened. The Chicago Tribune won a Pulitzer Prize in 1988 for its reporting on the Ottawa contamination. They lost the lawsuit in New Jersey, moved the operation to Illinois, and kept doing the same thing. The lesson they took from getting caught was to do it somewhere else and not tell anyone. 26. The devastating impact of smallpox on Native American populations during European colonization was primarily the result of accidental disease transmission before germ theory was understood, and the uniform application of that framing to the entire historical record requires ignoring documented primary evidence of deliberate biological warfare. The case at Fort Pitt during Pontiac's War in 1763 rests on unambiguous primary documentation. A diary entry from William Trent, a trader and captain of militia, dated June 24, 1763, recorded, "Out of our regard to them, we gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect." This was accompanied by correspondence between British commander Lord Geoffrey Amherst and Colonel Henry Bouquet, in which Amherst explicitly proposed sending smallpox-infected blankets to Native Americans as a means of extermination. Bouquet's response indicated willingness to implement the plan. The subsequent epidemic among Pontiac's Confederacy cannot be definitively attributed solely to this specific act versus other transmission routes, but the documentary evidence of intent is unambiguous. Native American populations had no prior exposure to smallpox, and consequently no acquired immunity, a condition that made smallpox extraordinarily lethal in indigenous populations, regardless of transmission method. Mortality rates in affected populations sometimes exceeded 90%. Some estimates suggest Native populations in the Americas fell from between 50 and 100 million at the time of European contact to approximately 5 to 10 million by the early 20th century, a decline primarily caused by epidemic disease. The uniform application of the accidental transmission narrative to this entire history functions to obscure the Fort Pitt case and the Amherst correspondence, which are among the most clearly documented instances of intentional biological warfare in the pre-modern record. Lord Amherst's name was removed from the city of Amherst, Massachusetts in 2023, following decades of debate. The documentary evidence includes the letter, the diary entry, and the explicit proposal. Applying a blanket finding of accidental transmission to the entire history requires ignoring a paper trail that has been in the historical archive for centuries. The blankets were not an accident. The archive that contains the evidence was not classified. It was just not widely taught. 27. The 2008 financial crisis was an unforeseeable market event caused by complex financial instruments that regulators, banks, and economists could not have anticipated in advance. The crisis was predicted in writing by multiple economists, regulators, and market participants. Specific warnings were delivered to regulatory agencies and dismissed. Fraudulent mortgage origination practices were documented and reported before the collapse. No major bank executive was criminally prosecuted. Economist Raghuram Rajan, then chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, presented a paper at the Federal Reserve's annual Jackson Hole Conference in 2005 that specifically warned that incentive structures in the financial system were creating conditions for a catastrophic market seizure. He was publicly dismissed by former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers as a Luddite. Economist Nouriel Roubini made a specific presentation to the IMF in 2006 predicting a housing market collapse, a mortgage crisis, and a broad financial crisis with remarkable accuracy. He was widely ridiculed at the time. FBI Director Robert Mueller warned Congress in 2004 that mortgage fraud was reaching epidemic proportions, and that if it continued unchecked, it would cause significant losses to financial institutions and adverse impacts on the housing market. Ratings agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch had financial incentives to rate mortgage-backed securities highly because they were paid by the institutions issuing the securities they rated. Internal emails from ratings agency employees released during congressional investigations showed analysts acknowledging they were rating instruments they did not fully understand. The Department of Justice did not bring criminal charges against any top executive of a major financial institution for conduct related to the crisis. The primary enforcement mechanism was civil settlements in which banks paid billions of dollars while neither admitting nor denying wrongdoing. Lanny Breuer, the head of the DOJ's criminal division during this period, stated in a documentary that he had considered whether criminal prosecutions would destabilize financial institutions, a form of risk assessment that explicitly weighed institutional stability against criminal accountability. Approximately 3.8 million homes went through foreclosure proceedings in 2010 alone. The warnings were in writing. The fraud was documented. The crisis happened. And the government's primary concern afterward was whether prosecuting the responsible parties might make the system unstable. The system, it turned out, was only considered stable if the people who broke it remained in charge of it. 28. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was a product of its time, conducted before modern medical ethics standards existed, and it ended when the ethical violations were discovered. Penicillin was established as the effective cure for syphilis in 1947 and became widely available throughout the United States. The study continued for 25 more years without treating the enrolled men. The United States Public Health Service began the study in 1932 in Macon County, Alabama, enrolling 399 black men with latent syphilis and 201 control subjects without syphilis. Participants were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a local term for various ailments, and were not told they had syphilis or that they were part of a medical experiment. When penicillin was established as a syphilis cure in the late 1940s, Public Health Service officials made a deliberate decision to withhold it from Tuskegee participants and to continue the study of untreated disease progression. Participants who were diagnosed with syphilis by physicians outside the study and offered treatment were tracked down by PHS officials, and the treatment was discouraged or circumvented. During World War II, 250 of the Tuskegee participants were identified through the draft process and ordered to receive syphilis treatment as part of military health evaluations. PHS officials contacted local draft boards and had the treatment orders rescinded for the study participants. The study's ethics came before a PHS-sponsored review committee in 1969. The committee expressed concerns, but concluded the study should continue. No external oversight body was notified. Peter Buxton, a PHS venereal disease investigator, raised ethical concerns internally in 1966 and again in 1968. He was told the study would continue. In 1972, he leaked the study's details to journalist John Heller of the Associated Press. The story broke nationally in July 1972. Following exposure, an advisory panel concluded the study was ethically unjustified. At that point, 28 of the original participants had died of syphilis. 100 had died of related complications. 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The cure was available in 1947. The study continued until 1972. The participants were not being observed for science after penicillin. They were being observed for the journals. It took a whistleblower and a newspaper to stop what the government's own internal review committees had identified and declined to act on. 29. The Golden Gate Bridge had no suicide barrier for decades because the issue was genuinely complex, too expensive, aesthetically problematic, and uncertain in its effectiveness, and the barrier eventually came when better technology and stronger evidence made it feasible. Psychiatric and public health researchers reached strong consensus on the effectiveness of bridge barriers in preventing suicide by the 1970s. The Golden Gate Bridge District voted down barrier proposals repeatedly over 5 decades, primarily for cost and aesthetic reasons, while an estimated 1,700 or more people died. The barrier opened in January 2023. The first documented suicide from the bridge occurred in August 1937, approximately 3 months after the bridge opened. The bridge became the world's leading suicide site by a significant margin. Research on bridge suicide barriers has consistently found that they significantly reduce suicide rates, and that the majority of people who are prevented from completing suicide at a given location do not simply substitute another method. A landmark 1978 study by Dr. Richard Seiden examined people who had been prevented from jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge and found that more than 90% were still alive or had died of natural causes years later. Despite accumulating evidence on barrier effectiveness, The Bridge District rejected barrier proposals through much of the late 20th century. The reasons cited included cost, aesthetic concerns about obstructing views, and continued questions about substitution, which researchers had consistently found to be minimal. A local journalist documented suicides from the bridge and advocated publicly for a barrier beginning in the 1970s. The Bridge District Board voted in 2014 to fund a stainless steel net system after federal and state funding was identified. The suicide deterrent net was completed and opened in January 2023 at a final cost of approximately $224 million. In the first year of operation, 0 suicides occurred from the bridge, compared to an average of approximately 30 per year in the preceding decade. The research was clear by the 1970s. The answer took until 2023. For approximately 5 decades, the primary counter-arguments were the view and the line item on the budget. The net cost, $224 million. The alternative was approximately 1,700 people, and the counting was incomplete. 30. The 1889 Johnstown flood was a natural disaster, an unprecedented rainfall event that produced floodwaters too great for any dam to contain. The South Fork Dam had been documented as structurally deficient for years before it failed. Engineers had warned about it. The private club that owned it had made modifications that compromised its integrity. After the flood killed over 2,200 people, not a single club member faced criminal or civil liability, and the court called it an act of God. The South Fork Dam was a former Pennsylvania state water reservoir, purchased, repaired, and converted into a private recreational amenity for the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, a members-only retreat for some of Pittsburgh's wealthiest industrialists. When the club took over the dam, it made several modifications, including lowering the dam's crest by approximately 2 feet to allow a road to pass over it, and installing fish screens across the spillways that reduced the spillway's discharge capacity. The club also failed to adequately maintain the dam's discharge pipes, which were eventually blocked. Multiple engineers visited the dam in preceding years and documented its poor condition. Mining engineer John Fulton inspected the dam in 1880 and submitted a report warning it was potentially dangerous. His concerns were dismissed. The city engineer of Johnstown had previously warned local and state officials about the dam's condition. On May 31, 1889, after heavy rainfall, the South Fork Dam failed. An estimated 20 million tons of water released in approximately 36 minutes and traveled 14 miles downstream at speeds estimated at 40 miles per hour, carrying houses, trees, and locomotives. Approximately 2,209 people were killed. South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club members contributed to a relief fund for survivors. Courts ruled that the flood was an act of God and no criminal charges were brought. The legal doctrine of the time did not clearly establish liability for dam owners in this context. The Johnstown flood contributed to subsequent changes in dam safety law in Pennsylvania and influenced emerging legal doctrine around liability for hazardous activities, though it took decades for those developments to produce meaningful enforcement mechanisms. A private club lowered a dam to install a fishing road, ignored every engineer who said it was dangerous, donated to the relief fund for the 2,200 people their modifications helped kill, and the court called it weather. The engineers' reports called it a broken spillway. God's legal representation was considerably better resourced. 31. The Boeing 737 MAX crashes, Lion Air Flight 610 in 2018, and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 in 2019, killing 346 people, were caused by a software flaw that Boeing discovered and corrected, and the tragedies led to genuine investigation and reform. The FAA had delegated critical safety certification authority for the MAX's flight control system to Boeing's own employees. Internal Boeing communications revealed that employees knew about problems with that system and concealed them from regulators. The crashes were preceded by a failure cascade that the regulatory structure, as it had been reorganized over preceding years, was structurally unable to catch. The Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, known as MCAS, was added to the 737 MAX to compensate for the aircraft's tendency to pitch nose up due to the positioning of its larger engines. MCAS was designed to automatically push the nose down when triggered by a single angle of attack sensor, a design that eliminated redundancy and could be activated by a single faulty reading. The FAA had over years progressively delegated more of its own certification authority to Boeing under a program that allowed Boeing-employed engineers to make airworthiness determinations on behalf of the FAA. Boeing employees who worked in this program reported being pressured by Boeing management to speed certifications. Internal Boeing communications released by the House Transportation Committee in 2020 revealed that Boeing employees were aware of MCAS problems during development. In a January 2019 exchange, occurring after the Lion Air crash but before the Ethiopian Airlines crash, a Boeing pilot wrote to a colleague describing the airplane in terms that indicated serious concern about the design process and its oversight. Earlier communications from 2016 showed another employee expressing that he would not want to fly the aircraft himself. Boeing had originally described MCAS to the FAA with a maximum deflection figure of 0.6 degrees. The actual maximum deflection was 2.5 degrees, a significantly more powerful nose-down input than what regulators had been told during certification. This discrepancy was not corrected before the aircraft entered service. Boeing did not require simulator training for pilots transitioning to the MAX, partly because simulator training requirements would have triggered contractual penalties with airline customers. The FAA agreed to this determination. Boeing certified Boeing's safety system, using Boeing's employees acting as FAA representatives. When an employee documented concerns about safety, the documentation went to a colleague. 346 people paid for that organizational chart. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.